Good morning. It's 9:30, time for our Bible study at Santa Cruz Community Church. I'm John Heberling, retired pastor and Bible teacher. We're studying the book of Genesis. Now, if you've been following with us for the last several times, we've talked about Jacob. Jacob is such an interesting character. So many things about his life to be thought about and applied, and however you can apply them. Now, we're just getting to the end of that in the 35th chapter. That's where we're starting, chapter 35. And you remember that Jacob, from all of his wanderings and struggles and all, returns to Bethel, where he saw the ladder when he was on his way as a young man. And now he returns there with his family, at that point in time, 11 sons and 1 daughter and 4 wives, as it were. And he makes a significant commitment to the Lord. He seems now to have become the patriarch. He gathers all the idolatry, the idolatrous statues and things from among people and buries them. God again says to him, as he did before, that he now is the inheritor of this plan of God's, that he will be the father of many people, like the sands of the sea and the stars of the heavens. And there will be kings, there will be nations, all this will come from him. And he will be blessed, and those who bless him will be blessed, and those who curse him will be cursed. All this is God's covenant with him. He just receives it. Like Abraham before him and Isaac before him, he just in faith receives this assurance from the Lord. And now he has reached maturity with all of this, and with the experiences, wrestling all night with with an angel of God. And now he is trying to be in charge of this rambunctious family of his. So after some events that we've already talked about, he starts go back to where his family home is. And I think I mentioned at the end of last week that it never mentions when his mother died, although at the end of the book it does tell us that his mother is also entombed in this cave that Abraham bought. But he gets back and his father is still alive. And but on the way, his beloved wife, Rachel, is having their second child, their second son. And she, as women have through the ages, died as a result of the childbirth. So she attempted to name the child Son of My Sorrow, but Jacob said, no, he's the son of my love. And so his name Benjamin. Now Benjamin is just a baby then, but the others are all growing up. So He gets back, and Esau now takes all of his family and his flocks and herds and moves away from what we would call the Promised Land. And notice in Genesis it's called Canaan because the people who lived there are Canaanites. Later it gets this name Palestine from the Philistines, and really that never really should be the name of the country. It should be Israel, and it is named Israel on the map. But anyway, he returns, he goes back to his father, and we see then that now Rachel has died, and his mother's nurse has died. We mentioned that last week. So we're kind of getting to the end of this. And then the text lists all of his sons. And then we get to the idea that the book of Genesis is going to record for history things that we really aren't that interested in our study now. So chapter 36, it says, this is the account of Esau. I've been told, though I didn't go back and count them, that there's like 10 of these through the book of Genesis where it says, this is the account of, or I think the King James says, the generations of. So this chapter 36, is all listing the descendants of Esau and those who rose to be the leaders. And we're not particularly interested in that, so we're going to skip it. So we go to chapter 37. In the process, we have read that Isaac died and was buried by both of his sons in that same cave. So now, at chapter 37, we really are, the book says that we're reading the story of Jacob, but actually, verse 2 of verse 37 says, this is the account of Jacob. Actually, we've had a lot of accounts of Jacob as the way we would look at it, and now this is really going to become the account of Joseph. Joseph lived in the land where his father had stayed in the land of Canaan. And Joseph is one of those characters of Scripture that's very remarkable in so many ways, and a really good guy all the way around. So, but he has some rough times. So we start off with young Joseph. The text says that he's 17 years old at this time, and he's taking his place with the brothers, tending the flocks and herds. The reason over the years why farm families like to have large families is because the kids became the workers. And so his 12 sons, now his 11 sons that are old enough are now tending to all of his flocks and herds. So that's what Joseph is doing. And he goes out from home and is tending things out. The text specifically says that the brothers that he's working with at this time are the 4 that are the sons of the 2 handmaids. And they did something. The text doesn't tell us what they did, but Joseph tells his father what they did. He rats on them, as our kids would say. He brought to their father a bad report about them. We begin to see right away that Joseph is a good guy, but there's an old saying that no good deed will go unpunished, and this is certainly true with Joseph. That he's trying to be the good guy and represent his father, but it doesn't work. Now, verse 3 is very significant in chapter 37. Now, Israel, Jacob is using his new name that God gave him, Israel, which means struggles with God. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. I don't quite understand that phrase. Jacob wasn't that old when Joseph was born. Joseph was born, like the others, all up there when he was tending Laban's flocks. Benjamin is the son of his old age, if you want to consider old age, because he's not that old when Benjamin is born. But the truth of the matter is that Joseph is loved more than the others because he is the son of Rachel, and Rachel is his true love wife. So Joseph is her son, and he becomes the favored son. Now, the brothers all understand this just from the way he treats, they would say he spoils Joseph, I'm sure. In our families, that's what would be said. But the thing that we know about this is that it says he made a richly ornamented robe for him. And you say, wait a minute, is this the robe of many colors? Well, it is in the King James. So I tried to do some Hebrew research on this, and I see from what I read that others who really know the Hebrew language don't know how to figure this out. The root word that is translated here, there's a word that means a coat or a garment. We say a coat. It wasn't a coat like this coat. It was a robe, more like the Arabs. We're used to the Arabs wearing. And but the root word from which this many colors is translated is a word that its root meaning is the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot. As we use in measuring, so many feet, we measure a horse so many hands high. So this word became, morning Ed, this word came to mean a measurement. And so you see the later translators say there's nothing in this word that talks about color. So they translated a richly ornamented robe. I get the idea that the hand width and stuff meant that it had broad stripes of varied material and was obviously a very ornate robe that nobody else wore, only Joseph. So his father puts this robe on his 17, 18-year-old son, and the brothers are very unhappy about this, rightly so. So now what happens next? Well, we know the story. What happens next is that young Joseph begins having these dreams. Joseph's dreams and his ability to interpret dreams are of great significance in his story. So he first has a dream that he and all his brothers are out harvesting grain. And the way they harvested grain, with a scythe, they took a stand of grain, then they gathered it all up and tied it into a bundle. And these bundles then could be taken to the place where they threshed out the grain. So Joseph and his brothers are all making these bundles, and in Joseph's dream, suddenly his bundle stands up like it was a real person, a living thing. And the brothers' bundles all come and bow down to it. So he tells his brothers this, and his brothers are not impressed. They say, you're saying that you're going to rule over all of us. So then the next thing is he has another dream, and he tells not only his brothers, but also his father this dream. He dreams that he sees the sun and the moon and the stars all bowing down to him. And his father says, are you saying that your mother, incidentally, his real birth mother is dead, but there's still a mother in the household, and he says, your mother and I are going to bow down to you. So his father didn't like this dream either. So do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and what he'd said. Now the brothers, I was getting some idea about the land and things that I was wondering, why did Abraham and Isaac and Jacob all move down into this land that we're told is wilderness, opposite the Dead Sea? It's the wilderness where John the Baptist finished growing up and ate locusts and honey and came out to be the preacher. It's the wilderness where Jesus had his confrontation with the devil. But I'm told that this is a seasonal kind of thing. In the summer, there were places where the sheep could pasture and the grass was very rich and good. In the winter, those places were a soggy mess. But in this wilderness, underneath the bushes that were there was grass, and so they would move and winter their flocks in this kind of, actually the wilderness was sort of protective. And then in the summer they would take them. So it's summer now, and the brothers have taken the flocks and the herds, and they've moved north up closer to like Shechem and Bethel, and they're taking care of the flocks there. So patriarch Jacob, Israel, says to Joseph, I want you to go up and check on your brothers, make sure everything's all right up there. This would seem like a sensible thing for him to do because he's kept Joseph at home, his favorite. and Joseph would be the right one to go and check on the brothers. So he sends him. And Joseph goes to where he thought they were by Shechem, and there's nobody there. He's wandering around, and somebody says to him, "Can I help you?" He says, "Yeah, I'm looking for my brothers." You know where they might have gone? Yeah, they went up further north, up by Dothan, to pasture their sheep. And so Joseph heads up toward them, and they see him coming a long way off, and they recognize the coat. And they say, "Here comes the dreamer." And so somebody says, "You know, I'm tired of this. Let's kill him. We don't need any more of his dreams and lording us over us and being the favorite." Now, it's interesting that the oldest brother is kind of responsible here. So Reuben, he says, "Oh, don't kill him. We don't want to shed his blood. Just throw him in this cistern." Now, what's a cistern? Well, in the rainy season, they dug a hole down to the rock, and maybe the hole would be like 10 feet deep or something, and the rain would come and run into it, and it would make a kind of a well. Then the water would be there for them to take out and use for a while until it dried up. But at this time of year, it's dry. So throw him in a cistern. And he's thinking that I'll come back when they're not looking, and I'll rescue him, pull him out, and I'll take him back to his father, the responsible older brother says. So the older brother is off hatching this plot. And in the meantime, here comes a caravan. It's interesting that this caravan are called Ishmaelites. We're still following. These are all the descendants of Abraham. It has begun to happen that Abraham's descendants are multiplying and sort of taking over the area. So the Ishmaelites have become traders, and I'm told that there is a real road that goes up from like the area around Babylon and in Mesopotamia. It goes up the river through Haran or Padam Aram, where the boys went to get their wives, and then down and goes down to Egypt. So this caravan are coming along with their camels and donkeys, and they stop there probably to rest and water. And so the boys say, "You know, why shouldn't we profit by this? Why don't we pull Joseph up and sell him as a slave?" So whatever bargaining they did, they finally agreed, and I'm told by my archaeological people that this 20 pieces of silver that they sold Joseph for was the normal going price of a good slave. So now Joseph has some really interesting and difficult times. I have a book by Max Lucado. Do you read Max Lucado's books? This one says, "You'll get through this," and it's all about, each chapter is about some kind of situation we find ourselves in, and his text all the way through this is Joseph. So if you want some ways of applying Joseph to your life, get Max Lucado's book. You'll get through this. So Joseph suddenly, from being the favored son with everything going his way, finds himself a slave. They tie a rope around him, no doubt, and tie it to one of their animals, and he's following the animal off into Egypt. And his brothers have gone off to eat their lunch. Then Reuben, the oldest one, comes back, and he looks in there, and there's no Joseph there. And he goes to the others and says, "He's gone. What are we going to do?" And they, I guess, laughed it off and said, "Oh, of course he's gone. We sold him." So what do we want to do now? Well, we kept his coat. His coat seems to have a lot of symbolism about it. And we're going to kill a goat, dip the coat in the blood, then we're going to take it back to Dad. And that's what they did. So they come back to their father and they say, "We found this coat." And of course, it all has dried blood on it. "Tell us, do you recognize this coat? Whose coat is this?" And of course, Jacob, Israel, says, "Oh, it's my son's coat. He's been eaten by wild animals." And he goes into deep mourning, And they try to cheer him up, and he says, no, I'll be mourning for the rest of my life. So, meanwhile, Joseph goes down into Egypt. It also calls these traders Midianites. This is another branch of Abraham's family. And when Moses flees Egypt, he goes and stays with the Midianites. So these are some of the tent-dwelling people of the area for many years thereafter. But the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are related. They're kind of cousins through Abraham. So they are working together. Some of them are Midianites, some of them are Ishmaelites, and so it changes. And incidentally, this caravan is taking spices that they harvest from plants in Gilead. Later on, one of the prophets will talk about the balm of Gilead. And we know that because it's in a song. Is there any balm in Gilead? Well, they're harvesting this stuff from plants that grow in Gilead and taking it to sell in Egypt. They also have myrrh. They have various things that the Egyptian women like to use on their skin. So they, back then we already have a cosmetics industry. So this is what they're trading. They take these things down and sell them at a good price in Egypt. Spices, balm, and myrrh, it says. So now we get to chapter 38, and I'm going to skip chapter 38. This is the one you want to tell your kids not to read. But the reason it's here is that the chronicler feels we need to account for this line of descent that leads to King David, and then on down through the kings and finally to the Messiah. So we're interested in it. And when we look at this in the Old Testament, we find out that Jesus had some skeletons in his closet. Some of these things were really things that, they weren't skeletons because God fleshed them out to be real people that he used. Anyway, we have Judah, who sort of rises up above his three older brothers and becomes more of a leader, and we'll talk about that a little later. And so he has two sons, and it specifically says that God killed both of his sons for some infraction. Now, I don't think this is God's usual way of dealing with people. So if you're really looking for ideas about God, you'd probably read this chapter and say, wow, what God did is interesting here. So, but in the process, the two sons are killed, so that breaks the line. So there's now no descendant of Judah. And what happens is that Tamar, the widow of his oldest son, pretends to be a prostitute and gets pregnant with Judah, her father-in-law, as the father of the child. And when Judah hears about this, righteous man that he is, he says, oh, she should be burned, this prostitute. But she has, he says, well, I'll pay you with a goat. And she says, I'll send the goat. He says, well, what'll you give me to know that it's my goat? Well, I'll give you this staff I'm carrying and my signet, the symbol of authority. So when he says, well, we should burn her because she's a prostitute, she says, well, let me tell you who's the father of this child, the fellow whose staff and signet this is. And Jacob says, oh my gosh. He says, what a righteous woman. She's taken care of needing to have a descendant. So it's her son and Judah's son who then picks up the line of Judah. And that's why this is in the book, but it has a lot of stuff in it that we just as soon not teach to our kids. So now we come to chapter 39, and we're back to Joseph. Joseph arrives back in Egypt. He arrives in Egypt, and the traders in selling their wares, they sell him. He's a slave. Strong, strapping young man. We found out later that he's considered very good looking. I guess it's not just the women of this family who are good looking. And apparently the men are big, strong men. Some of my men in the church in Medford that I ministered to for years were loggers and farmers and truck drivers. And my brother-in-law was one of these big, manly men. And he said, we get the idea that to be a Christian, you're sort of wimpy. Everybody steps on you, he says. But really, if you read in the Bible, the God's people were often very capable. So we see that Joseph was very capable, very big, strong, good-looking guy, and very good organizer. So he's sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. So I don't think this means that he was the general of the entire army. I think it means that the Pharaoh had a guard of people close around him, and Potiphar was their leader. So Potiphar buys him and makes him a household slave, works in the fields and does various things. And verse 2 of chapter 39 is a beautiful verse. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, that's interesting. Potiphar's an idolater in Egypt, and yet he sees that something about this Joseph, and I'm sure he understands that Joseph has a different view of God, worships this unseen God. So he sees that anything that Joseph does seems to come out right. Now, there are those who preach a kind of a gospel of success and prosperity, and they say, see, if you're God's person, God makes you wealthy. God really does these things. If you're not wealthy, God apparently isn't smiling on you. Well, I see that God makes his people wealthy. I also see that he has them sold as slaves. I mean, the thing about Joseph that is so appealing to us is that at every turn he seems to get kicked down, and yet the Lord always raises him up. I think that's Max Lucado's idea, that there are a lot of things in life that knock us down, and God really becomes God because he lifts us up. Now, that doesn't mean that he takes away all future difficulties. He didn't. It was a long time before Joseph really emerges from all these difficulties. So anyway, Joseph is now the Potiphar sees how capable he is. He makes him the sort of chief servant of his household. He runs everything. He runs the things of the household, the buying of groceries and things, food and the managing of the other servants. And so he's going about his work, doing his job, faithful to, you think this pampered boy who saw himself as the great one of a great family now finds himself a slave, and yet he's a faithful slave. He really serves. He does what's good for Potiphar. And this goes along well, except for Potiphar's wife, who keeps watching this servant now has risen up to be the leader of the household. And I'm sure Potiphar was busy with his things, and so she decides to have an affair with Joseph and take him in as her lover. And interestingly, Joseph knows that's wrong. Now, when he says what's wrong with it to her, first thing he says is, my master, everything he has, I can take care of. He doesn't keep anything back from me except you, because you're his wife. So how wrong it would be toward my master for me to do this. But then he also says to her, I'm not going to sin against God. So she keeps trying to get this to happen, and Joseph does what any smart person should do. He stays away from her. He makes sure that if he's around her, the other servants are there. But finally there comes a time that she's watching for, where Joseph comes into the household, into the house to do his tasks, and the other servants are gone. Maybe she fixed it so they were gone. So she grabs Joseph and she says, "Come to bed with me." And he says, "No, I won't do it." So she's holding his coat. Here is another coat, his garment, his outer garment. And so he just shrugs out of it and runs away. So she's got the garment. So she's angry. What is the saying that a woman, a person...
She'll have no fury.
Fury like... So that's her. So if I can't have him, I'm going to destroy him. So she calls the other servants and she says, "See, he tried to rape me, and he got away. He was scared off. He knew you guys were coming, but I kept his coat." And she keeps the coat until her husband gets home, and she tells him the story. And of course, he's angry. So it turns out, as I read carefully, that part of Potiphar's role in being the head of the guard was to guard the prisoners that were the Pharaoh's particular prisoners. So he oversees this, it calls it his house, but the jail where they are. And so he throws Joseph in this jail, but Joseph still belongs to him. He's still Joseph's master. So now perhaps Potiphar tells the jailer, who's his employee, that Joseph is a very capable person, or perhaps it just happens again that Joseph starts doing the tasks. I mean, the prisoners were given jobs to do, and everything he does turns out well. So the jailer says, "I can just sit and take life easy. Joseph will run the jail. He'll take care of everything." So Joseph is sort of elevated to be the head jailer in a way, under the actual jailer. Now, Pharaoh gets unhappy, that we're never told exactly what he was unhappy about, with his baker that bakes bread and special things for him, and his cupbearer. Now, the cupbearer, as I understand it, is the one who brings him his drinks, but the cupbearer is also supposed to sample the drinks to make sure they're not poisoned. So anyway, that's in some situations that's true. So this cupbearer displeases Pharaoh, and so Pharaoh throws the baker and the cupbearer in jail. So there they are in Joseph's prison, and they're turned over to Joseph to manage them and give them jobs. So now think about Joseph. He comes to do his job, verse 6 of chapter 40. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected, and he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" Can you imagine Joseph, all that's gone wrong with him, and yet he sees these two guys and he says, "What's the matter, fellas? You look so sad." Why should he care? Well, it's just the kind of person he is. "We both had dreams," they say. The same night we both had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. Now, Joseph doesn't say, "Well, I interpret dreams." He says, "Doesn't God interpret dreams? But tell me your dreams, and we'll look for an interpretation." He sort of assumes that that God is going to interpret these dreams through him. Has God communicated with this to him somehow? I suppose so. So the cupbearer first tells his dream. He says, "Well, in the dream, I saw 3 vines, and there were grapes on them, and I had a cup in my hand. And so I was squeezing juice from these grapes into the cup, and I took it and gave it to the Pharaoh. And Joseph says, well, the 3 vines are 3 days. And in 3 days, the Pharaoh is going to bring you back, and you're going to again be his cupbearer. Well, the baker hears this, and he says, oh, I got to have my dream interpreted. So he says to Joseph, I dreamed that I was carrying on my head 3 baskets of bread and various goodies that the Pharaoh likes that I'd made. And as I was walking along, the birds came, and they were eating the bread out of these baskets. And Joseph just tells him what it means. The 3 baskets again are 3 days. And in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to take you out of prison, but he's going to hang you, and then the birds are going to peck at your flesh. So 3 days later, the Pharaoh has a birthday, and the only place birthdays are mentioned in Scripture seem to be with these guys like Herod and who have birthday parties, and all their people come in and tell him how great they are. So he's having a birthday, and he's in a good mood. So he says, I guess I'll take those 2 guys out of prison. So he has them brought before him. And for whatever reason, we're not told, the cupbearer is restored to his place, and he's cupbearer again. But the baker is hung. And so now when Joseph tells the cupbearer that he's going to be returned to be Pharaoh's servant, he said, and when you're there, remember me and talk to Pharaoh about me, and I'd like to get out of this prison. So Joseph is not without the same kinds of desires we would have. I'd like to get out of this prison. So, but 2 years pass, and the cupbearer is doing his job and happy where he is, and he never thinks about Joseph until one morning the Pharaoh is kind of down, and I'm sure the cupbearer says, what's the matter, Your Highness, or whatever. And he says, well, I had this dream. In fact, I had 2 dreams, and I don't know what they mean. And the cupbearer said, well, that reminds me, I know I was not in your favor, and you put me in prison. But while I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew. I'm not sure where this word Hebrew comes from, but it starts to be used here. They're, of course, not Jews. Jew comes from Judah. And that comes a long down through history. They're Hebrews. There is in the line that someone named Heber, but nothing is special is said about him, so I'm not sure why they come to be called Hebrews, but they do. So he says there's this Hebrew slave, and he interpreted my dream, and it happened, and the baker's dream, and it happened just as he interpreted. So Pharaoh says, I want him, calls get this guy. So they find Joseph looking pretty disheveled and long beard. They take him, clean him all up, shave him, put good clothes on him, send him to the Pharaoh. I think maybe that's where we'll stop for today, and we'll take up with the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams and how Joseph then becomes under Pharaoh. He becomes second only to Pharaoh in Egypt after all he's been through, and what happens then with the family. So let's talk more about Joseph's sad situations. I don't know how old he is by the time he's standing before Pharaoh, but he starts out as just in his late teens, and it's hard to imagine what would have gone through Joseph's mind, isn't it? I guess he should have realized that his brothers hated him. He should have been a little bit more careful about what he told them about his dreams. But it never seemed to occur to him. This was just so interesting, and he thought his brothers would like to hear about it. But I think it just shocks him that his brothers hate him this much. And he must have heard, originally they were saying, well, let's kill him. No, just throw him in and then They take him out and sell him to become a slave. And all of a sudden he realizes, my life is gone. I'm a slave. What more can become of me? That certainly is applicable, isn't it? So if we think, well, why doesn't God bless me? Why doesn't everything I touch turn out good? Okay, that's fine, but what's your attitude when something goes wrong? God, where are you? Why did you let this happen to me? Well, that doesn't seem to be Joseph's attitude. He seems somehow to adjust and go on. And obviously, he still has this deep belief and commitment of his life to God when he says, oh, surely God, it's God who is the only one who can interpret dreams. And then he doesn't really make himself the special guy. He just says, God interprets dreams, and this is the interpretation of the dream. I'm sure glad I don't try to interpret some of my dreams, but anyway, God does seem to use this idea of giving dreams, very vivid dreams, and then using the interpretation of them to steer things. So what is God doing to steer things? He's called Abraham, he's tested Abraham with the sacrifice of Isaac. He's with Isaac, and Abraham and Isaac developed this kind of family strength and kind of sub-nation in among the people where they live. And then he deals with Jacob. We talked extensively about that. Jacob seems not really to understand who God is and what God is doing. But God intervenes. It isn't that Jacob found God, it's that God came to Jacob and revealed himself. And so Jacob then begins to learn more about his relationship to God. And now he's an old man trying to manage the family. And I'm sure that Jacob has to say, what has God done to me? This boy Joseph, who was really my hope for leadership in the family in the next generation, suddenly God has let him be killed by animals. So this is the kind of thing we see God doing or allowing to happen, and yet managing it so that it works out for what he wants to do, because this is the beginning of a long historic plan that leads all the way to Messiah. Okay, time is running down. Do you have any questions or comments about the life of Joseph?
You know, one thing that really jumps out at me going through this is thinking of the other 10 sons of Israel.
Yeah.
Right? Going through this story by story, you suddenly realize these are not good guys.
No.
Is there anything that we're told about them up to this point that makes them feel like good, heroic, these are God's chosen people characters? They're slaughtering cities and selling brothers into slavery and doing all of these terrible things, but yet these are the ones that will be the foundation of the 12 tribes. It's kind of an odd thing to think about.
And if we see that, we say, oh, well, Reuben's a good guy, then we have that little verse that I didn't dwell on either, that Reuben goes in and has sexual intercourse with one of the maids. And now she's much older than he is, but this doesn't seem to bother him. And some of the explanations I was reading is that, you know, when I read the archaeologists, they're digging up these cylinders with writing on them and interpreting it, and they're saying this was the society around this, and a lot of the things that we don't understand in the patriarchs' lives make more sense when you see how other people were acting at that time. So that one of the explanations they give me is that the oldest son thought that he was the inheritor, and anything that belonged to his dad now would belong to him. And so he felt like this was his privilege to do this. And all it says in the immediate text is, and Israel knew about it. Never says anything else. But when we get later, we have that time when Israel gives his blessings, as it were, to his 12 sons. And he says, okay, who's going to be really the lead guy in this? Well, it's not going to be you, Reuben, because you went into your father's wife, as it were, and that is a no-no, and so you are disqualified. And then the next two were the ones who killed the people of Shechem. He says that disqualifies you. So now we come down to Judah, and we really didn't see Judah as being such a great guy in this sale of Joseph. But anyway, Judah has said, well, you will be, your tribe will be the lead tribe. Now, something to watch for as you read Scripture down through the rest of it, that the children of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, especially Ephraim, we'll see that place where Ephraim is elevated above his brother. But when the 10 tribes break off, then 10 northern tribes are often called Ephraim. Mm-hmm. Why? Well, because in their minds they said, Judah never should have been the inheritor. Joseph should have been the inheritor, and therefore Joseph's sons. So Ephraim should be the lead tribe, not Judah. And therefore we have this tension, the dividing of the nation. So a lot comes back to how they interpreted the things that happened in Genesis. Yeah, I agree with you, Jerry. I don't see that these guys really qualify as the people that we would say we should shape the world by them. And yet, I guess compared to people around them, maybe they weren't that bad. And it's again the idea that God fastens on to those that he has chosen, and he makes them to be what he wants them to be. And yet, we know that I was very taken in this study, when I came to this idea that Israel means struggles with God. And I thought, yeah, and Israel, right up to now, means those who struggle with God. And their struggling often puts them in a very bad light. So I'm sure these boys were all those who struggled with God and sometimes showed themselves to not have the character we would have wanted to see in them. And yet God chose to stay with them. His promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is fulfilled through these boys and their descendants. And I mentioned that before, that we might get the idea from reading Genesis that this is all about the DNA, all about passing down, and so that's why they had to go back and get Rebekah from the family and Rachel and Leah. But from there on, there's no mention of this genetic thing. Now, further down in history, they intermarried with others of their line, their people. But at this point, they all intermarried with women around them, and yet God is following the track of this inheritance and putting this together. And the idea that we'll see in the next chapters of Genesis, that the way he chose to do this was, did he cause the brothers to sell Joseph as a slave into Egypt? He at least allowed it and watched it and used it, because moving the whole family into Egypt allowed them to become a separated nation that they would not have if they'd have just stayed in Canaan. They would have mixed and been kind of a mixed group in Canaan, another sub-tribe that was hard to distinguish. But by going into Egypt, when they come out of Egypt, they're a very distinct nation. And that's what God took 400 years of slavery in Egypt to do that, but God says it's worth it. Okay, we will stop there. Any other thoughts that you'd like to add to this? All right, let's close in prayer, and we'll pick up Joseph and Pharaoh's dream, story you know well, but we'll see if we can find some things to remind us of. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for the privilege we have of studying it together, of seeking for ourselves to understand how you shaped your people and what you did and allowed to happen. We just pray that you would give us wisdom as we read, and let us find in these stories something that can strengthen our faith and strengthen our understanding. In Jesus we ask. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Yeah.